So welcome everybody to our first event in the context of the creation of the Venezuelan chapter of Academics Stance Against Poverty, better known as ASAP. I am Maida Hochevar. I am professor of philosophy of law at the Faculty of Law of the University of Los Andes, Venezuela, and the director of the Human Rights. Okay, our agenda will be as following. First, Professor Thomas Pogge from Yale University will give his speech on global poverty for about 15 minutes, and after this, he will introduce ASAP to us. Secondly, we will have Professor Christi Rangel from University of Los Andes in Venezuela. As well, she will talk for about 15 minutes. And finally, we will have a Q&A section for about 10 minutes. Please remember that during the presentations, you can send any questions you have through the chat room. We will discuss them at the end. Let's start with our first speaker. Professor Thomas Pogge is one of the most important contemporary German philosophers who has made outstanding contributions in the field of global justice. He studied sociology in Hamburg, Germany, and got his Ph.D. in philosophy under the supervision of John Rawls at Harvard University. The presentation he will offer us today deals with the topic of global poverty. After his speech, Professor Pogge will present ASAP for around 5 minutes. Professor Pogge, you can start.
Okay, thank you very much. So I should say that I am well aware of the irony of an overpaid Yale professor giving a lecture in Venezuela about poverty. Obviously, you know much more about poverty than I do. And however, I will talk a little bit about the ways in which academics can maybe help in fighting poverty, what we can do to make things better. So to start, I will show you a little clip. Let me just load that up. I hope you can recognize these people, Steven Pinker and Bill Gates.
Thomas, we can listen to the clip. There is no.
You cannot?
We cannot. We can't.
Okay. But you could see it, right?
Yes.
Okay, I will then go to this one. What this basically was, can you see the screen now?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, so this is the picture that I wanted to draw attention to. This is sort of part of their little video that they did together. And they were basically saying everything in the world is getting better and better. Things are progressing dramatically. And as this diagram shows, hunger in the world has gone from somewhere around 18% of the world's population in 1991 down to almost zero. So this is the kind of picture that you sometimes get presented by politicians and by defenders of the status quo. They make it appear as though poverty is a thing of the past. Now let us look a little bit more closely what the real situation about poverty is. First, what is poverty? The official definition by our international agencies is in terms of income. They talk about an income level below which a minimum diet and essential non-food requirements are not affordable. Here are some of the key deprivations together with their official statistics. As you know, we have about 7.8 billion people in the world, and of them, about 700 million are officially counted as chronically undernourished. I will talk more about that, what that means in a moment. 2 billion lack access to essential medicines. 2.2 billion lack safe drinking water. 1.6 billion lack adequate shelter. About 1 billion have no electricity. 2 billion lack adequate sanitation, that is toilet facilities and hand washing facilities. About 750 million adults are illiterate. They cannot read and write. And about 152 million children between 5 and 17 are employed in wage work outside their own family. This is not work in the family, but work for wages outside the family. So this gives you a sense of the official picture of poverty that our international organizations present. Now, the incidence and trend data, how much poverty is there, is it going up or down, are highly contested. There is a lot of fighting over that, and our international agencies are beholden to governments. Governments want to show good results. We are committed to fighting poverty. We are very successful in our fight against poverty. So these statistics are often unreliable because there is so much political pressure on showing the data that politicians want to show. Now, the two statistics that are most relevant to the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, the two statistics that are most often presented in the West at least, are statistics about poverty, income poverty, and statistics about undernourishment, also known as hunger. Those are the two flagship statistics. Here you see the official data from the World Bank. The World Bank is the keeper of the poverty numbers. And you can see that poverty fell by about 40% between 2008 and 2014. A 40% drop, huge success against poverty. This happened at the very end of the Millennium Development Goal period, where governments wanted to show that they had achieved a lot in fighting poverty, that their globalization project had been very successful. Here are the undernourishment statistics. The upper line is the line as it was until a year ago. It shows basically no progress, very little progress in the same period between 2008 and 2014. Very small progress, not even 10%. Now, something interesting happened last year, or this year. The Chinese suddenly decided that they had much less hunger than had heretofore been reported. Hunger has been overestimated, overstated by more than a factor of 10. Hunger is much, much smaller. And so now the dark orange line is the one that is valid. There is almost no hunger anymore in China, when before there was well over 100 million people. Anyway, these are the latest statistics, and you can already see that when a number bounces around like crazy from one year to the next, these numbers are really quite unreliable, and they are driven by politics and not by any kind of empirical inquiry. I mention that because academics can play a very important role in telling the world what is really going on about poverty. Another thing you can see here is that the hunger numbers and the poverty numbers are diverging. So poverty is falling very steeply, hunger is falling very little or not at all. And you can already see from that there is no reliability in these numbers, because how can poverty fall and hunger remain very high? Anyway, let me talk a little bit about the hunger numbers, the poverty numbers first, which are developed by the World Bank, and what the problems are with the poverty numbers. The first thing is, poverty is measured by the World Bank as a number of people below a certain income level. And that makes the statistics and whether poverty is going up or down highly dependent on how high or low you set the number. It turns out that if you set the poverty line very low, there is much more progress against poverty than if you set the number at a higher level. Secondly, there is the problem of translating income from one year into another year and from one currency into another currency. That is extremely difficult because you are dealing with many different goods and services whose prices vary across time and space. So here you can see just a comparison between, let's say, an Indian household in 1985 and an American household in 2005. You can compare by going 2 steps. You go from Indian rupees in the year 1985 to Indian rupees in 2005. And then you go from Indian rupees in 2005 to US dollars in 2005. The first time you're using the consumer price index of India. The second time you're using the purchasing power parities between India and the United States. If you go the other way, going 85 US dollars first and then to US dollars of 2005, you get a completely different result, more than 30% different. So this already shows you that the methodology used by the World Bank is a garbage methodology. It does not really tell you anything about the purchasing power that Indian households had 20 years or 30 years earlier. One way the distortion comes about is through the use of these averaging devices like consumption CPIs and PPPs. Here you can see the development of prices in the United States over a period of 20 years. Some things became much more expensive, like hospital services. Other things became much cheaper, like computers and TVs. Now, CPIs and PPPs are an average across all these different prices. And that gives you another big problem because many of these prices are completely irrelevant for poor people. Poor people don't buy airplane tickets. Poor people don't buy expensive stereo systems and so on. What poor people really buy is food. And so for them, some of the prices that play only a small role in the CPI are very important for their daily consumption. And so again, the use of CPIs and PPPs is highly inappropriate if you want to find out what the purchasing power of poor people is relative to their basic needs. Now, with regard to PPPs, it turns out that they systematically distort. PPPs are comparing the purchasing power of 2 different currencies, let's say dollars and Indian rupees. Now, there are differences that are sometimes very large and sometimes very small. They are small with regard to things that are easily traded across borders. They are large where there are things that are not easily traded, like services, for example, or land. You cannot buy land in India and sell it in Manhattan and you also cannot buy a haircut in India and sell it in Manhattan. So that's where the big price differences are. And of course, what poor people need most of all is food. And food is something that is tradable across borders. So it tends to go to where the highest prices are paid. And therefore, price differences between India and the United States in food are not very large. So the purchasing power of Indian rupees is overstated because the World Bank is assuming that many things are much, much cheaper in India. And that is true, but the things that are much cheaper in India are not the things that poor people really need to buy, like food, for example. Another problem with the World Bank's poverty line is that governments are trying to reduce poverty and focus their attention on people who live just below the poverty line, because those are the cheapest ones to lift. You lift them just a little bit, and then they are no longer poor, and you have solved the problem. But of course, that's ridiculous. People who are just above the poverty line are still very badly off. And people who are far below the poverty line should also get a lot of attention. It's very important to improve their position, even if we cannot get them across the poverty line. Fifthly, household surveys disregard the distribution within the household. So in many households, women and children are disadvantaged. Men eat first and the women eat the leftovers. This sort of inequality inside the household is systematically overlooked because the World Bank gives the same average per person income to all members of the household. And the final problem is that if you look only at income, only at money, you are overlooking very important dimensions of poverty. For example, how many hours do the members of the household have to work in order to get that income? So the World Bank says that these two people are equally poor, even though one person works only 3 hours a week to make their income, and the other person works 60 hours a week to make the same amount of income. If the income is equal, then the World Bank says, oh, they're equally well off. But of course, the person who works 3 hours could easily increase his number of hours. Maybe that's a hippie somewhere in the US, whereas the person who's already working 60 hours cannot increase their work. Now let's look for a moment at hunger and undernourishment. The FAO is defining undernourishment with 4 conditions. They say that somebody is undernourished or hungry when the food they ingest contains less energy than would be necessary for a sedentary lifestyle, and that deficit lasts for over a year. Now, this is a very, very narrow definition of hunger, and in reality, many more people are undernourished than the World Bank admits. What they're overlooking is absorption problems. So many people can eat something and really the food is not digested because they have parasites that eat some of the food. People need more than just energy. They also need vitamins and minerals to be well nourished. And the World Bank is ignoring that, is only looking at energy. Many people work in very strenuous jobs, and so they need many more calories than what I need as a computer worker. And also, if you wait for over a year to count some person as undernourished, many people already die much before that, because of course you can die within 40 days if you don't get enough food. So the definition of the FAO is extremely narrow and misses a majority of those people who are undernourished. So in short, progress against poverty has been much less impressive than has been officially celebrated. That is not surprising because governments want to show success. Here, academics can make a big difference by helping in getting us appropriate numbers about poverty. Let me conclude with one last remark, and that is that the official statistics all tend to be diachronic. They compare existing poverty with poverty in the past, and they're saying things are getting better, we are making progress. And most people in the West are very happy with that. They think, oh, progress is being made, things are getting better. But really, if we think about poverty, not in terms of a goal that we want to eradicate it, but in terms of a human right, then we should compare it not with the situation in the past, but with what is now possible. And what is now possible is a world in which poverty is entirely eradicated. The world in aggregate is easily rich enough to eradicate all poverty, and we should not be content with making progress against poverty, but we should really insist on it being wiped out as quickly as possible and not over a period of many decades. In this regard, it's particularly important to reform our global institutional architecture and to make the world economy, the basic rules and regulations of the world economy, more poverty avoiding. I won't have time to go into the details, but that's a very important aspect of what we need to fight for. We need to fight poverty both within states and work towards better policies, less corruption, and so on, but also at the global level, where often the ground rules of the world economy favor the richer countries and the big multinational corporations at the expense of poor countries and their populations. I will now talk a little bit about academics stand against poverty, what that is, and what you might be able to do if you join it. It is an international organization of intellectuals, of basically academics, that is focused on helping poverty researchers and their teachers enhance their positive impact on severe poverty. So these are academics who do not really want to passively analyze the problem of poverty, but who want to contribute to overcoming it. They want to do poverty-focused research that is practically relevant and important towards reducing poverty around the world. We do this in three main ways: by collaborating among one another, collaborating across disciplines, across national borders, and across universities. So we are using the already existing, very important and very well-appointed network of universities. We piggyback on that in order to do meaningful work against poverty. Second, we do outreach. We try to inform politicians and the general public and civil society about poverty and about how to reform institutions, how to make progress against poverty. We think about alternative ways of advancing against poverty and publicize those, basically informing and enlightening the public and others. And finally, of course, we are engaged in particular interventions against poverty. We observe these interventions, we find out what works, what doesn't work, what are best practices, and then try to publicize the results and make sure that our efforts against poverty get better and better over time. Here is a special issue of a journal that we did maybe 8 years ago, where you can see a bunch of essays written about this project, Academics Stand Against Poverty. If you can get a hold of it, I can also send a copy to anybody who might be interested, and you can see a little bit about the thinking that went into the founding of ASAP many years ago. Some people object that universities should be value-free. Universities should just be places of inquiry, and they should not be politically engaged. They should not take a stand for or against any political issue such as poverty. Now, against that, one can say first that academics are already involved. Especially economists are great defenders of the status quo. They always argue that things have to be the way they are, that we are living in the best of all possible worlds, that poverty is already as low as it can possibly be, and so on. So there is no purity and innocence of academia to be preserved. We are simply taking the other side of the issue and challenging some of the Panglossian views about poverty. Secondly, the global poverty problem is so enormously large and so horrible in terms of its consequences for ordinary people that one simply has to take a stand. One cannot sit apart and do nothing when hundreds of millions of people are suffering very severe deprivations. Third, there is the ideal role of educators in society, that we as educators have a responsibility to tell people what is really going on in the world. And if, for example, bad figures are being propagated about poverty, people lie about it and present the trends as being much better than they really are. It's our responsibility as educators to inform the public that this is not really what's going on. Fourthly, the poor are for the most part voiceless. Their voices cannot be heard. They have no chance to express themselves in the media and even in social media. And so somebody has to speak for them, or rather lend them their voice, allow them to speak, give them a voice, help them to be heard. And again, here we can, as academics stand against poverty, make a big contribution to make sure that poor people themselves are heard and their experience of poverty is conveyed to the public at large. Finally, academics are very well trained in the usual academic exercises of description, explanation, assessment, and reform, which are exactly the exercises that are needed to get a sense of what poverty is like and to overcome it. So academics are very well prepared to take up a role in the fight against poverty and to actually accelerate that fight and make it more successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Pogge, for your interesting presentation. Now we turn to our second speaker, Professor Christi Rangel. Professor Rangel is Director of the Economic and Social Research Institute and a full professor at the University of Los Andes in Venezuela. She studied economics and got her Ph.D. in economics and business sciences at the Autonomous University of Madrid. She has been postdoctoral visiting scholar at the George Mason University in the United States. She is coordinator of Transparencia Venezuela Chapter in Mérida, allied to Transparency International. The title of her presentation is Great Corruption and Poverty in Venezuela. Professor Rangel, you can start.
Thank you very much, Maida. It's my pleasure to be here and share this moment with all of you. And thank you, Thomas Pogge. I am economist, but I'm not the part of the economist you mentioned before. Okay, I'm not to defend the status quo, and of course not the status quo in my country. That is it is going through a very difficult situation. So I'm going to share my screen to present my speech, Brand Corruption and Poverty in Venezuela. Transparency International, hereinafter TI, defines corruption as the abuse of the entrusted power for private gains. The abuse or diversion of power can occur in many ways to obtain advantages of various kinds: economic, social, political, moral, etc. TI highlights that corruption can happen anywhere, in business, government, courts, media, and also in civil society organizations. Corruption also can involve anyone, not only politicians and government officials, but business people or members of the public. Also, corruption adapts to different contexts and changing circumstances, and it can evolve in response to changes in rules, legislation, and even technology. So let's see two ways of being the corruption according to perspective of law in countries or documents in international organizations, and also characteristics of corruption according to TI. Corruption can be typified on the one hand for forms described in national laws like bribery, embezzlement, nepotism, money laundering. But TI has proposed to catalog corruption according to its magnitude and level of authority involved in grand corruption and petty corruption. Petty corruption refers to everyday abuse of entrusted power by public officials in their interaction with ordinary citizens, who often are trying to access basic goods or services in places like hospitals, schools, or public departments. Grand corruption, on the other hand, is the abuse of high-level power that benefits the few at the expense of the many and causes serious and widespread harm to individuals and society, and it often goes unpunished. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has warned about macro corruption, systemic corruption structures involving complex form of state capture, cooptation of state structures, and even diversion institutional for criminal purposes. About macro corruption, lawful actions coexist with illegal. Various agents, both state and non-state, attend a complex framework without clear territorial limits. So let's see links between corruption and poverty. Every time corruption occurs, at least someone is hurt. Depending on the magnitude and the scope of influence of the authorities involved, damage can vary. Resolution 1/18 from Inter-American Commission on Human Rights highlights that corruption has a serious and differentiated impact on the enjoyment and exercise of human rights by historically discriminate against groups, such as people in situation of poverty, women, indigenous, migrant, etc. Corruption affects people living in poverty and extreme poverty due to their vulnerability. They suffer aggravated consequences of the phenomenon. Poverty and discrimination may expose marginalized people to bribe solicitation. A research from TI in more than 100 countries clearly shows that in countries where more than 60% of people report paying a bribe, almost 5 times more people live on less than $1 a day than in countries where less than 30% of the population reports paying bribes. Deviation of power when carrying out procedures or petty corruption have a high impact on poor people, either because they are excluded or because transaction costs and undue charges weigh heavily on their disposable income. Corruption in the management of public resources jeopardizes the capacity of the governments to comply with their social rights obligation, including health, education, water, transportation, or sanitation. The inefficient operation of these services will take away opportunities and capacities from those who need them most, which undermines the state efforts in favor of equality. Also, Inter-American Commission is concerned about corruption linked to social programs aimed at sectors in poverty. Said programs fail to meet the purposes for which they were designed when fraudulent, clientelist, and patronage political practice occurs. In the case of women, corruption can perpetuate and reinforce existing inequalities, especially in places where women's access to economic and political power is denied. Women are among the most affected because they account for the largest proportion of people living in poverty, and there are far fewer women in decision-making bodies than men, which leaves them in a particularly vulnerable situation when there is corruption. Of course, in the case of micro-corruption or grand corruption, it causes extended damage, stimulates discrimination, and aggravates the socioeconomic situation of low income and excluded people. Again, because it usually affects the right to food, health, housing. It also compounds social inequalities by increasing the power of elites and giving them more incentive to hold onto power. In words of former TI President Jose Ugaz, corruption kills, makes sick, denies clean water, education, health, jobs. Corruption also denies freedom. Let's see our case, Venezuelan case, an unfortunate case of grand corruption. According to the Corruption Perception Index 2019, prepared by TI, Venezuela is the most corrupt country in Latin America and the 5th most corrupt in the world. But beyond the indicators of perception, Transparencia Venezuela, national chapter of Transparency International, has corroborated through multiple researches that systematic policies have been applied in the country. We are talking about planned acts that are part of a way of exercising nine countries. Transparencia Venezuela has identified 12 harmful elements that shape the grand corruption pattern since 2003. I'm not going to explain all of them, but some of these 12 elements. The first one, monopoly in the economic sectors, incentive for corruption, the implementation and permanence of price controls, exchange controls, and generalized subsidies for gasoline and some food led to an increase in corruption practices. Now, COVID-19 controls are promoting extortion practices. Discretionary public spending. The government modified the organic law of financial administration of the public sector on 13 occasions since 2001. It did that to relax checks and balances and prevent accountability. Fiscal indiscipline explained the hyperinflation that has impoverished the majority of the population in our country. The fourth one is civil military control. The fifth, permanent state of emergency. It has been a practice since 2000, the periodic publication of decrees of a state of exception and emergency to concentrate decisions in the executive power and avoid formal and citizens' control. Irregular millionaire procurement, institutionalized impunity, the elimination of the autonomy and independence of the public powers. There are guarantees of impunity for corrupt officials and also for those who have been implicated in human rights violations. Opacity and lack of accountability, disinformation and communicational hegemony, loyalty-based appointment of senior government positions, transnational criminal network. I'm going to talk about this and give some data. International networks involving governments, companies, and other groups have been built to legalize money from corruption. So far, there are 83 corruption cases investigated in 21 countries involving Venezuelan officials. The sectors involved are food, health, electricity, housing, transport, mining, hydrocarbons, drugs, financial and customs services. And the last one element is human rights violation and criminalization of social protest. And about this, I'm going to explain right now. With information from the follow-up report of the 2030 Agenda in Venezuela, elaborated by Synergia, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights described the situation in Venezuela as complex, serious, and multidimensional humanitarian crisis. Among its main characteristics are the convergent incidence of economic, social, institutional factors such as the contraction of the economy with hyperinflation, frequent interruption of public services such as electricity, drinking water, gas, the accelerated deterioration of the services of health, a serious food insecurity, the shortage of medicines, especially for chronic disease, the insecurity, political instability, and persecution. According to Synergia, the main global indices placed the country in 2020 on the short list of countries that require urgent assistance. It's one of the 10 biggest food crises in the world, one of the countries with the greatest restriction for the entry of humanitarian aid. It's one of the countries with the more low capacity of the health system to face the pandemic, COVID-19, and it has been classified as in high severity conditions, with characteristics of a regional crisis, which also affects Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, and Trinidad and Tobago. But talking about poverty with information of the ENCOVI 2019-2020, Venezuela is the poorest country in Latin America. Average daily income is $0.72 per day, less than the limit of the $1.9 per day. From 56% in 2014, income poverty jumps to 96% of citizens, of which 79% are extremely poor. 65% of households are in multidimensional poverty situation. 33% of the population suffers from severe food insecurity, and 44% of the population suffers moderate food insecurity. Between 2012 and 2017, Venezuela drops 16 places in the Human Development Index. Also, there is territorial inequality considering multidimensional poverty level, from 29% in Caracas metropolitan area to 74% in small cities and hamlets. In Venezuela, there has been a desperate migration due to the increase in poverty. Many have been forced to migrate without planning, without the required documents, and without guarantees of reception in the destination country. More than 5 million displaced people are counted. Children and young people don't have access to education in conditions and quality that allow them to overcome poverty. School no longer offers opportunities, and young people must work for its family support. COVID-19, with its mobility restrictions, had a direct impact on the loss of employment. Also, because of COVID, remittance from people who migrate were reduced from 9% to 5%. Finally, it is worthy to mention that recently oil spills from El Palito refinery, which belonged to the state-owned firm PDVSA, and other spills documented by ecologists in several states are affecting bodies of water, the flora and the fauna, and local economies. Undoubtedly, the cut of the state explains what is happening in Venezuela. Despite this devastating impact, the authorities have been perfecting the grand corruption pattern and have made it a systemic and widespread practice. Faced with this reality, the fight against corruption is vital. A struggle that must include human rights, make visible and prioritize the effects of phenomena on vulnerable groups, and actively involve citizens. Transparent and accountable governance can help development in countries where the rule of law is strong. Progress has been made toward achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Indeed, rule of law and good governance are just as important as economic growth in reducing poverty, according to research that compare Millennium Development Goals achievement with the aggregate value of scores given to countries in the section of the Global Integrity Report covering anti-corruption. Good governance and anti-corruption were not included in the original MDGs, but they are included in 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. It's the goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And we see that a transversal objective in these Sustainable Development Goals. We can mention important the promotion, the rule of law at national and international levels, and ensure equal access to justice for all, substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms, develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels, and ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. As multilateral institutions started to pay attention to the corrosive effect of grand corruption on poverty and inequality, we hope today we have helped to better understand the causes of the humanitarian emergency in Venezuela and why we become the poorest country in our continent, despite all the promises that our natural resources give and all the situation we've been through in the last century. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Rangel, for showing us what the current situation in Venezuela is. Now, Professor Johnny Antonio Davila from ASAP Venezuela will moderate the questions and answers section.
So I wanted to say that I would like to offer thanks to Thomas Pogge and to Christi for their presentations. I think the presentations were very illustrative about the global situation of poverty today, and also about, in the case of Venezuela, it was very illustrative about the connections between poverty and corruption. So I'm supposed to be a kind of moderator in this webinar. However, I think that at the end of the day, the most important is to know what our attendants are thinking. So that's the reason why I prefer to read some questions that we are receiving from our attendants. I'm afraid we can't answer all questions, but we are trying to discuss at least 4 questions. So what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to read one question for Thomas, one question for Christi, you answer, and after that, I'm going to read 2 more questions, one for Thomas and one for Christi. So the first question is for Thomas. The question is the following. Professor Thomas Pogge, don't you think that when we see poverty from the global perspective, there are the risk of disregarding national or local complexities? In the case of Venezuela, for instance, there are many problems that contribute to poverty and that are connected to history and to other specific features of the country in the Latin American region that cannot be seen properly if we focus on the big picture. So this is the question for Thomas, and I'm going to read the question for Professor Rangel. So, Professor Rangel, besides the criminal groups in Venezuela, do you think that the immense poverty in Venezuela is associated with criminal or with international criminal groups, as in the case of Alex Haab from Colombia? Are they part of the main cause? So, Thomas, if you want, you can start.
Yes, I'm happy to start. And this is a very important and interesting question. And of course, when you emphasize the international aspects of poverty problems, you must never do that at the expense of the local factors. The two interact with each other in 2 different ways that are very important. One is that the effects of local factors and the effects of international factors are mutually dependent on each other. So what the effects of a local factor are depends in part on the international factors that are in play, and even more obviously, what the effects of a local factor are depends on the international. So the 2 are interacting in their impact. The effects intermingle, if you like. The second thing is that local factors are often very heavily influenced by international factors. So we saw that beautifully in the lecture a moment ago by Professor Rangel about how the various other countries in the world sustain a network of corruption in Venezuela. Right? Transparency International is working on this issue all the time, working out what role tax havens play, secrecy jurisdictions, for example, in enabling corrupt people within a particular country to bring resources outside the country, to shuffle value, money, resources, raw materials outside the country for their own benefit. So corruption would be much, much harder in Venezuela and in every other country if you didn't have a network, an international corrupt network of tax havens, of law firms, of financial advisors, of corrupt government officials and bureaucrats, all standing by helping corrupt people to save their loot into safe places. If you only had Venezuela in the world, it would be very hard to find a safe place for the assets that you're stealing from the state, and much less would be stolen. So, and this is the same is true in many other ways. For example, economic problems within a country often are aggravated by the rules of the world economy, or political problems such as autocracy or tyranny in a country are facilitated by international factors such as the arms trade, for example, that people deliver weapons to a corrupt ruler, to a tyrannical ruler, or support that ruler with money or with diplomatic support in various ways. So by emphasizing the global factors, I'm emphasizing the factors that we in the developed Western countries are perhaps most responsible for. We do much more harm through the global institutional arrangements we impose than we do within our own countries, even though there's a lot of harm there also. But that does not mean by any means that the local factors are unimportant. The local factors are very important, but they are shaped and influenced by international factors, and their impact on the situation of poor and vulnerable people is often amplified or modified by international factors. The two are interpenetrating, interdependent.
So thank you, Thomas. Christi, you can answer.
Well, as I said in my intervention, we describe in Transparencia Venezuela one of the 12 harm elements of grand corruption is the transnational criminal network. As I said, it is involved governments, companies, and other groups. And it is worthy to mention that there are 38 cases investigated in the United States of America, 9 in Spain, 6 in Argentina, 4 in Colombia, 3 in Brazil, Portugal, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, 2 in Italy, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, and 1 case at least in other group of countries. What I mean is that, of course, there are important international networks helping the people who have the power in my country. And as you know, the case of Alex Saab, that this is a man that has been involved in many social programs from government, and also because of the researches of journalists like Armando Info page, we know that he takes advantages with overpriced votes of food, and also he participated in housing programs. And other researchers from our organization shows that there is irregular international groups actively involved in mining in our Bolivar state, and also in other states that are in the border with Colombia. So of course, there is an important link between international criminal organizations and the situation in our country. We also can talk about the role that has played another governments like Cuba or Russia in our situation. It's important to say that the Cuban government has been an important ally in the application of clientelist practices, social coercion, strategies of surveillance system to our population. These links have undermined political and civil rights, and also Russia has been a supplier of weapons and has been an important ally of the regime in multilateral organizations.
So thank you, Christi. I'm going to read 2 more questions. There is one question by Jesus Urbina. That's a question for Thomas. Greetings, Professor Thomas Pogge. I certainly have to say that I'm guilty. I know nothing about your work until now. These views on poverty are mind-blowing. Nevertheless, I fear that academic responsibility in such a way you expose it could be taken as the duty to some kind of political action. That's okay for me, but is there a way to avoid a stereotypic ideological stance when it comes to fighting poverty from the academic perspective? So that's the question for Thomas, and I have one more question for Christi. So the question is the following. Professor Rangel, do you think that corruption is the main cause of poverty in Venezuela? Are there no other causes more important, such as the inability of politicians like Maduro, Cabello, Delcy Rodriguez, and so on? So, Thomas, please.
Yeah, so I think it is very important to avoid a stereotypical ideological response to poverty. So I think that one thing is pretty clear: we oppose poverty, right? Poverty is not a good thing. If poverty is avoidable, there is reason to avoid it. But saying that is not ideology and is not stereotypical. I think that is a pretty obvious thing. But then when you go beyond that, you ask questions such as, for example, how important is it to fight poverty? What are the main arguments for saying that we have a responsibility to fight poverty? And these are open questions. So for example, I have a long debate with Peter Singer, right? Peter Singer is a utilitarian who says that the main reason to fight poverty is because the marginal cost of my giving money to poor people is smaller than the marginal gain of the poor people. I emphasize something completely different. I say we are actively harming people by upholding institutions, rules that foreseeably and avoidably keep people in poverty. So we are not merely not helping enough, but we are actually harming people. So the normative discussion is an open discussion where academics can disagree. And also all the empirical questions are open questions where we need real good research in order to understand what the best methods are for fighting poverty, right? People have fought poverty and often have made matters worse. They have tried to deliver food into a civil war country, and the food was captured by the rebels. And in the end, they sold the food abroad, they bought weapons with the food, and they killed more people. So these are questions that we as academics should be very open-minded about. We should always be willing to listen to arguments, normative arguments, factual arguments, explanatory arguments, to see, and also arguments about how to reform institutions. What is the best way to ensure that corruption in Venezuela is ended? How can we make the institutions in Venezuela more corruption-proof? This is not obvious. There's no ideology is going to help you there. You have to think this through carefully. You have to look at the empirical evidence. You have to do some trial and error, do some experiments. You have to learn from what has worked in other countries, what has failed in other countries. So I think that the fight against poverty is a fight that has very little room for ideology and stereotypes. If you want to be successful, you have to be open-minded and empirical and listen to the best arguments.
So, thank you, Thomas. Christi?
Well, if we take the idea that the rule of law and good governance as just as important as economic growth in reducing poverty, and if we know that our regime has destroyed the rule of law and good governance, and this has been intentional, this has been planned, we can say that the reason that we are today have this terrible crisis about poverty is linked with corruption. As I said before, when we talk about the pattern of grand corruption, we are talking about a systemic policy that is planned. and this has been planned to be the way it has been. So for this reason, we cannot believe that the situation with our poverty, it can be explained by the, as you say, our government, our people in government don't have enough preparation. Just remember a few things I mentioned in my speech. The monopoly of the state in economic sectors like electricity, of water. We said that these services, these basic services, are very important to help people and give opportunities and capacities to people. And these are not working after the government take a monopoly of such services and try to make huge enterprises that were all of them involved in millionaire procurement with corruption links inside. Also, the incentive for corruption, the implementation and permanence of the price controls, and most of all the exchange controls that explain the loss of millions of billions of dollars in our country. And also the strategy of having an emergency state to concentrate power in executive and avoid formal and citizen controls has been the causes to limit human rights and also limits our free expression. And you know, everything we have had with the violation of human rights. The regular millionaire procurement, they left unfinished works in many basic services, as I mentioned before. And you know that in all of these were the pay of overprices in many contracts the government did. So I think all of this is part of a plan, and all of this situation we live now, it's to guarantee the power who people right now in the power and have this control to benefit these criminal international networks the government is related to.
Thank you, Christi. So there is some more questions that we don't have enough time. That's the reality. So thank you so much, Christi. Thank you, Thomas. It was a pleasure for us to have you today. And before ending, I want to announce our next webinar. This webinar, the topic of this webinar is gender and poverty. So it means we are going to discuss the relations between gender and poverty at the global level, but also at the national level. And when I mean national level, I mean Venezuela. So it was a pleasure for us. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.